Hey, IB History Scholars, it's Mr. Newcomb here. Want to continue with the discussion of topic 12, the Great Depression and the Americas. In this particular session, I want to focus on part 2, which will be on Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal. When Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected in 1932, his approach was going to be a break from the Republican presidents of the 1920s. He was going to be more active. He's going to be willing to experiment, so he will be coming up with a flurry of legislation or executive orders that is going to try to address the Great Depression, adjust with the time, and realize that this is an extraordinary event and we are going to need to change our approach, and then ultimately show compassion. One criticism of Herbert Hoover was that it looked like he was disconnected, that he didn't understand what was going on with the American public. FDR was going to fix that by showing that government can be much more compassionate and understanding, and his fireside chats are going to be very instrumental in doing that. His two primary objectives here was he wanted to maintain American loyalty to the government and the capitalist system, as well as create conditions favorable to capital accumulation. So basically what that means is he's looking to find a way to overhaul the system, but not completely overthrowing it. Understands that the American system is a pseudo-capitalist system, and just try to find ways to keep it. Methods to achieve these objectives is he had a group of advisors, whether it was his cabinet officers or directors of agencies, as well as people in the business world and in academia, advise him, and they became known as the Brain Trust. And then his economic philosophy was known as Keynesian economic philosophy, and which would be a break from the previous administration's schools of economic thought, which was Friedman's. And basically, it was called prime the pump. In difficult times, you do flood or send relief packages, money into the system in order for it to recitate and be able to flow and have success. All right, so further on with his approach, there's going to be three phases to it. Phase 1 is the 100 days. Phase 2 will be the first New Deal, and that is also part of the 100 days. Then you have the second New Deal and the third New Deal. The third New Deal is in some ways going to be shortchanged, I guess, for lack of better words here, because the World War II is just going to be happening in Europe, and new focuses will need to happen here. The three major efforts to address the short and the long-term goals here, we tend to call it the three R's: relief, immediate assistance, recovery, permanent reform, address the abuses. It's not a true blueprint, but it gives this idea that there is some coherent thought to what he is going to do. So when we look at the first 100 days and the first New Deal, he is going to be very aggressive, and in some ways he's going to approach it as if we are at war. So again, it's going to focus on the three R's. He's going to take on all of them in this particular phase of the New Deal here. He's got a lot of them, and I'm just going to focus on the ones really in bold. The Emergency Banking Relief Act, which is sometimes called the National Banking Holiday, he shut down the banks and had a quick overview of looking at finding the banks. The Federal Reserve System looked to find the banks that are solvent, put money into those banks, and then when they opened up, he assured American public that Those banks will not go under. Those banks will be safe and be a good idea for you to start putting money into those banks again, start saving. That was a huge measure, won him a lot of support among the American public. To back that up, he comes up with the Glass-Steagall Act, or called the Banking Act, which is FDIC, which is still around with us today. That would be a reform measure, and that is going to guarantee that your deposits in those banks will be secured. So if that bank ever went under, your money is safe. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, this was a relief measure to farmers. It was to give them some subsidies because he is going to ask them not to farm as much acres or to produce as much milk or have as much livestock, and the federal government is going to give subsidies to those farmers for perhaps that lost income. It is going to be ruled unconstitutional, though, by the U.S. Supreme Court, mainly because of how he was going to raise the funds to pay those subsidies. The TVA, or the Tennessee Valley Authority, is a relief, a recovery, and a reform measure here. It's still with us today here. The TVA was to provide flood control in the Tennessee Valley region, but probably more importantly, set up a series of dams that are hydroelectric that's going to provide electricity to this region who normally didn't have it. So put them on the grid. The Civilian Conservation Corps was a relief measure to help provide jobs to 18 to I think 25, 26-year-olds, guarantee them a monthly income, part of it to them, part of it to their families. The idea is to get these young people off the unemployment roll, put them into various jobs, and these jobs could be simply going out and building state parks, national parks, cleaning up river systems, constructing infrastructure in the rural parts of the United States. It was a very successful measure. It was run by the U.S. Army, and so there was a sense of order and military aspect of it, which did create some detraction as well. And then the Security and Exchange Commission here that would be passed. The Security Exchange Commission, or the SEC, is still with us today. That was a reform measure, and that was to be realistically to take care of the stock market, to police it, to prevent it from having these inside traders, these investment pools that try to find a way to manipulate the market, tried in some ways to prevent big downturns, and we are going to have some big downturns in the stock market since this, but because of these measures that is being created here, it's going to try to create some type of parachutes. When we look at the New Deal, though, it is going to create, especially when he starts doing these measures, it's going to create some critics here. Some are going to say it's not going to go far enough. Others are going to say it goes way too far. So here are some of the critics of the New Deal early on. Senator Huey Long would say it didn't go far enough. We need to put more money into people's hands here, and that will help. Consumers will help get this economy going. And so he called it to share our wealth. Very controversial in that the $2,000 per family probably is not attainable, but he was gaining some ground. It was becoming very, very popular. Some looked at him as a demagogue. He was considered a threat to FDR, but He will be assassinated in 1936, and he will not have an opportunity to challenge FDR here in the 1936 election. Father Charles Coughlin, he called for the nationalization of the banks. He had created the National Union for Social Justice. The thought was, just make all banks, public and private, all part of the federal government, and all under the arm of the Federal Reserve banking system, and that will create a sense of stability here. Dr. Francis E. Townsend, the Townsend Plan, $200 monthly stipend to the elderly, give them a pension, pretty much, and use that money then to most likely put back into the economy here, help stimulate that. That idea actually is going to be built on into the Social Security. The rise of third parties like the Communist Party and the Farmers Labor Party here in Minnesota begin to gain some traction here. People started looking at them as an alternative. The U.S. Supreme Court started ruling some of his legislation unconstitutional. He tried to mess with it with his court packing scheme, where he could add a new justice for everyone that was over 70 years old. Could have meant that eventually that Supreme Court could be up to 15 justices. He wanted to pack the court with his New Dealers, and in the end, that did happen. Congress didn't go along with it. That definitely would have messed with the balance of power. And then the American Liberty League, which were conservatives, Republicans, and business leaders saying, FDR, you're just simply bankrupting the country, scale back. The second New Deal is going to happen here, and he wants to build on some of those measures that were in the first 100 days here. The second New Deal programs concentrated on relief and reform still. The 1934 midterm elections brought back radicals. So he's going to be able to continue to aggressively address the problems of the Great Depression, and he's going to be able to respond to his critics here. He gets a measure known as the Work Progress Administration, the WPA, which is a big agency, huge umbrella that is going to create lots of public works type projects here, and it is going to be spending millions of dollars. Some of it will work, some of it won't. But the WPA is going to be very instrumental in providing that relief that people are looking for. The National Labor Relations Act, the Wagner-Connery Act, all that, what that really means is laborers or unions are going to gain some legitimacy here. They're going to be allowed to collectively bargain for new contracts, for higher wages. So this is a big win for organized labor in general. The Revenue Act or the Revenue Tax, taxing restructure, hope to reduce deficit spending by simply changing the tax code. And the tax changes are really going to fall heavy on corporations and on the wealthy. Hope to reduce deficit spending because more tax revenue will be coming in. And then finally here, the Social Security Act, which is a big crowning piece of legislation. Social Security is going to provide that monthly pension for the elderly. And that's provide relief, but also a sense of reform here. So the Americans public can at least have some money when they retire. Other measures might need to happen here, but at least they got that monthly pension coming in from the federal government, still with us today. Overall, when you look at all of this, again, the attempt is to provide that relief and reform. Now, a lot of what he's doing is resting on a new type of school of thought here known as Keynesian economics. Roosevelt was apprehensive about pouring too much money into the system, but two key advisors, Harry Hopkins and Harold Eichels, convinced him that this is probably the best method to do this. In difficult times, you put money into the system. In good times, you just step back and let the system work itself. That's where we come with this idea of priming the pump here. Government should create additional demand by becoming a major purchasing consumer of goods and services, encourage investments through tax policies, facilitate the growth of exports, and make use of deficit spending. That's all the components now of Keynesian economics, and that's what FDR's administration is going to attempt to do here. It seemed like things were working out, and in reality, we were still very fragile, because in 1937, we enter recession after he gets reelected. He began to pull back on federal spending, and boom, the economy goes down. It's titled Roosevelt's Recession. It was his attempt to try to balance the budget. Unemployment increased, and as a result of that, he has to go back to some of those New Deal measures. And so in his third New Deal, when you look at the nature of the third New Deal here, the scope was limited because of the national mood. In the 1936 election, there was some moderates and conservatives that did get into Congress, and they began to challenge FDR's approach. Some measures will happen here, but not to the far-reaching effects as perhaps the others. When we look at the Fair Labor Standard Act, which is the minimum wage, federal government for the first time is going to have a minimum wage here, and so that's a new idea, a new phenomenon back then. We still have it today, but the thought was at least have a baseline here. When we look at the limits to the third New Deal, though, a clash with conservative Democrats here. Americans fear that the development of a dictatorship that came out in the 1938 poll here, considering that how he was acting as president in terms of a lot of executive orders, undercutting the authority of Congress, a lot of fears, and of course the events in Europe and Asia with the rise of Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, and their actions in Europe, and then of course in Asia with the rise of a more militarized Japan. So when we look at limits to the New Deal, the New Deal legislation, it was simply loaded with special interests. Basically, in order for FDR to get some of his legislation passed, you would have to cater to certain groups. And so when we look at farm measures, may not impacted all farmers. It may have impacted only the large farmers, or impacted the farm corporations in general. So these measures were full of special interests. When we look at, how did it help out minorities and women? Well, for African Americans, it's rather mixed. They had a small voice in FDR's administration. We call that a black cabinet. And they would constantly remind FDR that, hey, you need to take into consideration minority groups like African Americans. No anti-lynching legislation, something the NAACP had been advocating for. He wasn't going to take that on. He didn't have the political will. If he was going to have his New Deal measures passed, he needed to get Southern Democrat votes. He was willing to give that up. And the Democratic Party was, again, restricted here by Southern Democrats. Eventually, A faction of them will emerge, and we'll call them the Dixiecrats. American Indians here mixed as well. However, in 1934 Indian Reorganization Act, given a little bit more autonomy back to the tribes. That was a huge step for American Indians, especially when you look at the devastation of the Dawes Act. Mexican Americans mixed, and actually what we found out is over 400,000 of them are going to be deported, and some of them were American citizens being deported with this idea of open up jobs for Americans. Women was mixed as well. When we look at the workplace, continue to be paid less. Many times, like other minority groups, women found themselves being unemployed or laid off first. However, FDR will be the first to appoint a woman to a cabinet position as labor secretary, and that's Frances Perkins. All right, now to wrap this up here, the legacy of the New Deal: FDR's expansionist fiscal policy stimulated the nation's economy. Simply did do that. Confidence in the economy and government improved. That was a huge measure there as well. The general public accepted the new role of government, especially in times of economic distress. And we kind of go back to this model in some form of it at times. World War II will continue the gains made by the New Deal, gains across all of society here. Opponents felt that the New Deal undermined states' rights, free market principles, and social traditions. And so what we'll find after FDR, after his administration, the future administrations in some ways are going to find ways to tweak it, to build on it, or to reduce it. Okay, this is the end of part 2, and in part 3 I will focus on Canada and how they approached this Great Depression.